Hi, everybody. Thank you for all being here. My name is Marshall Curry, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion of the short documentary Hunger Ward, which is a really amazing, amazing film. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a big fan of Skye's work, and I'm thrilled to be here with Skye Fitzgerald, who's the director of Hunger World and Hunger Ward, and also Shireen Al-Adeimi, who is a Yemeni activist. Do you want to introduce yourself, Shireen?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Shireen Al-Adeimi, and I was born in Yemen. I've been working on kind of highlighting the role of the U.S. in Yemen over the last few years, and I'm also an assistant professor of education at Michigan State.
Well, thanks. I just want to begin by talking for a moment about this film. This is such a powerful film. It is. It's one of those films that's sometimes hard to watch, but really important to watch. It's crucial, and it does what I think some of my favorite documentaries, what the best documentaries do, which is kind of open up a part of the world and the people who live there to an audience that might otherwise have no knowledge of them. And that time that you spend with the people in this film really shifts the way that we see the world forever after. So thank you for doing that. I feel like I've read 1,000 headlines about Yemen, the conflict and the suffering, but it really took this film for me to humanize those headlines and turn them from something abstract into something that really demands attention. So congratulations, Skye, for doing that. And also for the folks that are watching, we're going to get to some questions. There's a Q&A sort of chat where you can put in questions, and I hope to get to some of those. But before we get to that, I just wanted to kick things off by asking you, Skye, sort of tell me about the genesis of this project. How did this movie get started, and why did you want to make this film now?
Yeah, you know, I guess my view of the world and as a filmmaker, Marshall, is life's short, right? And I feel like every moment, in particular every project, is important in terms of what I choose to focus the lens on. And I guess I've just never been a filmmaker who's been interested in doing, a film about dandelions or teddy bears. I tend to gravitate towards. I guess I've always felt a responsibility to choose topics where the stakes are high and current, and where we as a community can intervene in some positive way. And for Hunger Ward, the fact that there's a 6-year-old child in this world who weighs 15 pounds due to malnutrition, that crushes me. It crushes me as a dad. It crushes me as a human being. And knowing that our government is complicit in that situation and partially responsible for it really served as motivation for me for this project from the outset. And it's been sort of the driving motivation behind actualizing it and trying to get as many others to care about it as well. So that was kind of the catalyst for it for me.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, this particular story, this particular location, these particular characters, how did you decide this is where I'm going, this is why I'm telling this particular story right now?
Yeah, it was a confluence of factors. You mentioned headlines earlier. You hear a lot about all these headlines surrounding Yemen, which were just there's a lot in the news right now, as there should be, rightly so, because it's such a crisis on so many levels, humanitarian as well as geopolitical. But I have a number of colleagues who have worked extensively in Yemen, and a couple field producers who I have longstanding relationships with, and they kept communicating to me just how bad it was in some of these clinics and how difficult it was for the doctors and the nurses to gain access to the most basic things, just fundamental supplies in order to treat children who are on the verge of death by starvation. And so those were long running conversations that eventually led to conversations with the doctors themselves. And once we established that and started talking directly with the doctors, I just felt like it was something I couldn't not do. It was something I had to respond to as a human being with this particular set of tools as a filmmaker, right? To shine a light on something that we can change. You know, it's a human caused famine, and humans can change the course of it as well.
Shireen, you're part of the Yemeni diaspora, so you've witnessed this war from afar for years. Can you talk a little about how it's catalyzed you as an activist, and also talk about the film and what your reactions were to it?
Yeah, I mean, the film, I think, I, to be honest, I'd avoided watching it for a while. We were in touch, I was in touch with Skye and Michael, the producer, and I'd avoided watching it because the thing that got me into this work was another video. It was back in 2015, and I was a doctoral student at the time in Massachusetts, and I was just absolutely devastated that this was happening in the place of my birth. I have a lot of family members in Yemen at the time. My grandmother is still alive. And in all of the major areas, we had family members. And so every airstrike, we were on our phones checking in on people every single day, multiple times a day, just to make sure people were alive. And at some point, I realized that the videos are really getting to me. And so I thought, if I want to maintain, like just my normal day-to-day life, I can't watch any videos coming out of Yemen. So I would read the news, I'd get myself informed in hopes of being able to do something about it, but I just avoided all videos. And then one day I watched a video and it just crushed me. It was a father who was filming, and as an airstrike was falling somewhere close to the house, and he was, kind of trying to hide his kids while still filming, and saying, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. But you could just hear the fear in his voice when as he was running to the basement and telling his kids not to be afraid. And I was, honestly, I was just crying. I couldn't stop crying. And that's when I decided I was going to do something. I was going to not be an anonymous person on Twitter anymore, and I was going to try to do something about it. And, I wrote a letter to my senator at the time, Elizabeth Warren. So this is what got me into this. But watching this film kind of took me back to that moment of, I'd avoided watching videos, clips coming out of Yemen since then. And so I was avoiding this film, and then I finally saw it. And I couldn't. I kept pausing it, and I kept crying, I kept sobbing, but I kept going back to it. It was just so powerful, so important. Those little girls in the film, I just connected with them as somebody who was living in Yemen when I was their age. I was 7, 8, 9, 10 when I was living in Yemen, 11, 12. And I just saw their faces, their names are familiar. Aden is where I'm from, where I was born. And so to see that clinic there, it brought it home for me. It was so devastating, so painful. And honestly, it served as just yet another push to action, even though I had been doing this work for so many years. It just pushed me to act and do some more, because you see what's at stake. You see these kids dying in a very violent manner, struggling to even smile. And it just brought the importance right back to me.
Skye, the film obviously focuses on malnutrition clinics, but you also touch on the role that bombings play in the creation of the nutrition crisis. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you thought about those elements when you were making this film.
Yeah, it was kind of an essential question in my mind, because it really is a conflict where there are no clean hands. There's blame to go around. But in particular, the air campaign over the country by the Saudi-led coalition is a particularly brutal series of commitment of war crimes. The bombing campaign has been almost constant. It's been disproportionate. There's been a consistent use of precision guided munitions against civilian targets, against a school bus full of children, multiple MSF facilities with big medical crosses, on their roofs. Farms have been targeted to prevent the production of food. And so as a filmmaker, I had to sort of think through this and decide how to distill this down, because it is, there's a direct correlation, right, to the famine and this air blockade over the country. So I chose to do it using a single representative event, which in my view sort of illustrates the way that air power is being used in the country. And we decided to focus on an airstrike that happened in October of 2016. And it was initially, excuse me, it was a missile fired by the Saudi coalition in Sana'a at a memorial service where hundreds of people were to memorialize someone's passing. And it was a missile fired by a Saudi plane with U.S. operational support. It hit the memorial service and killed an estimated 140 people, many of them children and women. And the attack was a triple tap, right? So they hit the memorial service, and then as people rushed to either leave, and then rescuers came to try to get survivors out, it was hit with a second, and then with a third missile. And again, this is a civilian memorial service, right? And afterwards, they found fragments of the missiles at the site, and they were made by Raytheon, an American company, of course, right? And so, sadly, that story is one of many that I could tell, right? This is happening consistently over and over again. And, Makia, who is the nurse in the north, I asked her about these missile strikes while we were there working with her many times. And, the one thing she said to me, which just resonated so deeply, was she said, Skye, the Saudis and the Americans and the UAE, they feed us, right? And then they kill us. And I don't understand why, right? And to me, that's just completely horrifying, right? But that's the reality that many people, especially in the north of the world, of the country, are living in. And it's why at the end of this scene where we sort of show the aftermath paired with some cell phone footage of the strike, it's why it's the one moment in the film where I go to a sync sound interview of Makia, where she speaks to the fact that she doesn't know whether Abir, or one of the children she's treating, is going to live or die. But then we hold on her, right? And she just gives a look to the camera directly that to me is just searing, right? It's part accusatory, it's part steely resolve, right? That says to me, no matter what you do to us, we will survive, and we will carry on this work, the work of saving children amidst the chaos of war. So I feel like that was a good way to sort of close out that sequence. It was so it was a distillation process to try to just use a representative scene to show something that's happening throughout the country and has been consistently for 6 years.
Mm-hmm. And we see a lot of suffering in the film. There is, acute malnutrition, there's children who die, but there's also survival and improvement. Can you give us an update on the subjects of the film? What's happening with people who we get to know?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually some really good news even amidst the pandemic. So even though the pandemic has been devastating to the country and to the clinics, and the lack of humanitarian aid pledged to the UN, the Yemen operation for the UN is the largest humanitarian aid operation they run, and they've been really lacking funding the last year. And Shireen can probably talk to that more in a moment. But in terms of the people we follow, sadly, we do bear witness to children dying in the film, right? It's a stark reality that we face almost every day in the clinics. But there's also some great hopeful stories. And so two of them are the two girls that we follow most closely in the film, Omeima in the south and Abir in the north. Both of them were clinically diagnosed by doctors at both clinics, received medications to sort of arrest many of the complicating factors they were having from severe acute malnutrition, and then were given proper diets to sort of offset their stunting. And so we've received regular updates from both Nurse Makia and Dr. Al-Sadiq, and both girls are recovering really quite nicely. And both doctors believe that their stunting is actually going to be less extreme than they thought, because stunting is one of the long-term, chronic effects sometimes of severe acute malnutrition. But they believe that both girls, because it was caught relatively early, are actually going to recover, and if not, gaining their full stature that they would have outside of this condition, they believe they're going to mostly recover and only be stunted to about 80% of what they thought was possible. So they're hopeful stories. They're actually recovering. So the good work goes on.
Shireen, the United States obviously had an election that has changed out the president. What do you see as the potential changes in our policy toward Yemen? What are the possibilities? What are the likelihoods? What are your fears? And yeah, how do you sort of see things going forward?
Lots of hopes and fears. This war and the US's involvement began under the Obama-Biden administration. So that airstrike that Skye mentioned, where 140 mourners died, that happened during Obama's administration, and it led to no change in the support that the US provides to the Saudi-led coalition. And then, of course, Trump, in the 4 Trump years, we've had absolute escalation of this war, even when we didn't think escalation was possible. But the Democratic platform began to, the Democratic Party began to speak out against the war with a lot of civil, the work of activists was basically bearing fruit over the last few years. And we passed a War Powers Resolution in 2019 directing Trump to end U.S. hostilities in Yemen. Of course, he vetoed that, but that meant that we were finally building momentum. And so by the time Biden was on the campaign trail, he was making promises about ending U.S. support for this war. And in the first month, it's been a month since he's taken office, there was some damage that the Trump administration managed to do late in, basically in the last few days of their administration that he's trying to undo. So they designated the Houthis, who control northern Yemen, as terrorists. And thankfully, the Biden administration has reversed that, because it was a misuse of the designation, and it was going to cause to outright starvation of the 70–80% of the population. And the other thing he did is he's reviewing arms sales that the Trump administration was trying to send to the Emiratis, who's another party to the conflict. But he's also said that he's ending intelligence sharing with the Saudis, which is massive. The Saudis rely on U.S. intelligence. And he said that certain relevant arms sales are going to be reviewed and canceled, and then offensive operations are going to end. So these are hopeful things, but also leave a lot of questions. So this whole thing started as a defensive operation, defending Saudi Arabian territory. And if we're back to that framing now, which is what Biden has said he wanted to do, then where does this leave 30 million Yemenis? What does it mean to have relevant arms sales versus irrelevant arms sales when the Saudis and Emiratis are bombing Yemen with everything that the U.S. is selling them? And the U.S. also provides other forms of logistical support. We train their soldiers and their pilots. We provide targeting assistance. Up until 2018, the U.S. was providing mid-air refueling. And so the U.S. is as involved in the war as Saudi and the UAE. So it remains to be seen what ending support really looks like, but we're pushing for ending all forms of support. The other important factor here is that the Trump administration cut aid to northern Yemen, where, again, 70–80% of the population lives. And so we're hoping that the Biden administration would restore that aid right away, not as a charity, to be honest. It's our responsibility. We were involved in the bombing of these people and the starvation of these people for 6 years. The very least we can do is not only end the bombing and lift the blockade, but also provide reparations. And Yemen right now needs a lot of aid, a lot of support for people to get their lives back on track, but the war is still going on, unfortunately.
I'm seeing a couple of questions coming in to the chat. One person asks, which involved party has the greatest amount of support among the Yemenis? What percentage of Yemenis support the Houthis?
Shireen, I'm gonna let you take that one.
That's a really difficult question. It's a great question. It's a very difficult question to answer. Let's talk about the different parties in Yemen who are involved in this war. The Hadi government is the one that the Saudis ostensibly are trying to restore back to power. Hadi is based in Saudi Arabia. He cannot land in Yemen without getting in trouble. His government recently landed in Aden, and they were bombed as soon as they arrived in the airport. So I venture to say that if there's one thing that unites most Yemenis is that nobody wants Hadi back. Then there is the STC in the south, who is a separatist group that is funded by the UAE. Separatists, Southern Yemenis. I'm a Southerner. I understand this, want of separation, seceding from unity. This has been going on since 1994, and it's a long struggle. But the problem is that the STC is funded by the UAE, like I mentioned. So there are some ulterior motives there, and they rule much of Southern Yemen. Then there are the Houthis, who control most of northern Yemen. And security-wise, it's relatively safe for most people in northern Yemen outside of airstrikes. And so there are no massive, uprisings against the Houthis or anything like that. Granted, people are starving, the economy has collapsed, so we don't really know. The fact of the matter is there has not been we've not had elections. The whole point of the revolution in 2011 was to bring about elections, and we've not had elections. But I suspect that the Houthis are much more popular than people want to believe. And, they're not a militia or a, terrorist organization like the Trump administration tried to conceive them as. And they have to be contended with as one of the groups that the US is going to have to talk to, or the Saudis are going to have to talk to. There's also the Muslim Brotherhood Party, the Islah Party, who is part of the coalition as well. And they don't control much in Yemen either. And they're also based in Saudi Arabia. So most of the people in Yemen are either separatists or the Houthis. And the separatists control about 20% of the country, alongside the Saudis and the UAE and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And then the Houthis control the rest.
Another question is about the specific food aid that's being delivered. It says, if celiac disease is becoming such a problem among children due to getting too much gluten from the high percentage of wheat in food aid, is this problem being addressed by providing non-gluten food sources to those in need? Do either of you know anything about that or have thoughts about that?
I think we could probably tag team that one. Shireen, I'm sure you know some about that. I talked specifically with Makia, as well as with Dr. Al-Sadiq about this issue, because they do see a number of patients who do exhibit this lack of tolerance, right, for gluten. And in sort of some of the case studies that Dr. Al-Sadiq showed me from in the south of the country, it is a phenomenon, right? It's a very real thing that, especially for children who early on in their development, right, were mostly subsisting on humanitarian food supplies, right? There is a reliance on gluten-based products for a lot of those base foodstuffs. So it is a real thing that tends to develop if children don't have access to a broader spectrum diet, right? So it's really a function of the war and the scarcity of access to a balanced diet, frankly. So it's really the poorest of the poor who tend to exhibit this gluten allergy. So it's widespread, but it's not consistent. It's very disparate throughout the country in terms of how children respond to it. But it is a very real phenomenon, and one that I think the UN and other NGOs who work in the country would say, well, we provide a lot more than just gluten-based products, and they do, but access is always an issue, right? There's so many checkpoints and there's so many barriers to making sure all of that aid gets to where it needs to go in a reasonable amount of time, that it's just not accessible to those who need it sometimes on the timeline that they need it.
Yeah, to add to that, so prior to the war, Yemen was the poorest country in the Middle East. They imported 90% of their food. And it's one of the most water-stressed countries in the world as well. So even I remember when we'd visit Yemen, we'd get we'd import our water from Saudi Arabia. And so given the blockade, all of these imports are severely restricted. And so 80% of the population became dependent on aid. And much of this aid, is gluten-based, right? Because it's easy to transport. But even that aid, it sometimes sits in ships and it rots. And so by the time Yemenis have access to it, it's rotten wheat, and they can't even eat that. And so, let alone things that are more perishable, right, than wheat. I think, like you mentioned, Skye, access is a severe, huge blockades, internal and external, for access. And many of the people living in rural areas, they're lucky if they get anything, let alone a healthy, balanced diet. And so I don't think that there's a concerted effort that I've seen that addresses this, because we're still trying to just talk about bare minimum aid so that these people don't starve to death, and none of these other problems like sensitivity to gluten have been addressed, I don't think, in a really substantial way.
Yeah, and just to add on to that briefly, Marshall, one of the things that's really fascinating, to see how the clinics operate is it's access to medical care at all is critical, right? Especially in the north, but also in the south. The hospital and the clinic that we focus on, Sadaka in the south, it is the sort of hub for severe acute malnutrition in the entire southern part of the country. So the distances that families have to travel to get this specialized care that really only this hospital in the south can provide on a long-term basis, those barriers are significant. And there are hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of travel that they have to somehow afford, right, financially, but also to get through all the checkpoints necessary to get to the hospital is an incredible barrier. And sometimes they simply can't make it, right? And so it's this access issue that's consistent throughout the country that's really a huge challenge.
And part of those challenges are, the fuel. There's massive fuel shortage because of the blockade. And so when people don't have money for fuel, they don't have money for transportation. They don't have money for a hotel to stay at if they're coming from rural areas and they don't know anybody in the city that they can stay with. The family can't just send a child and say, okay, I'll see you in a couple months. They have to stay with them. And so it becomes a huge financial burden for the families to make it to these places. And at least 55% of Yemenis have zero access to healthcare. And the ones that do are contending with hospitals that have been bombed, that are barely functioning at 10% capacity because of the shortages in fuel and personnel due to the blockade.
Skye, I want to talk to you a little bit about the making of this film. What was your setup like? What was your, what was your crew, and what was it like filming in this location with this, in a war zone?
Yeah, it is a conflict zone, as Shireen just mentioned. When some of Hadi's government tried to land in Aden a month or 6 weeks ago, however long it was, it was struck with missiles, right? And dozens of people died. So we had to sort of factor in that reality into everything we did. And so, one of the fundamental principles we used was, exposure. How could we mitigate our exposure from the conflict itself, right? And rather focus on the effects of the conflict on civilian populations, right? And so that's where we built these deep relationships, with the two clinics and the doctors and the physicians in those clinics and their patients, so that we could sort of embed in those two facilities, both of which are highly respected. And then we just tried to mitigate our sort of outside exposure as much as possible, right? Because this wasn't a film. I didn't have any interest in really going to the front lines and showing what direct combat looked like. That's not what I was interested in illustrating or showing. I really wanted to show how it's affecting the common person, right? And so we did that by building these deep relationships with the doctors, and we partnered very closely with two field producers who I built relationships from the outset, months and months and months out. And then very carefully worked out the nuanced nature of that relationship, because Yemen is such a dangerous place for a journalist to work, that we wanted to make sure that however we did this project, we didn't endanger any of the people we're filming with or any of our collaborators on the ground. And so we worked out this very delicate arrangement where we, as sort of the privileged Westerners, it was only two of us, right, were the face of the project in country, but we still tried to stay out of the public face as much as possible on the streets. But at least in the places where we were filming actively, I was the public face of it, because I wanted to leverage my privilege as much as possible and protect our local field producer, right? And so he asked not to be named while we were filming, and worked very carefully in the background to protect him, because journalists are shot and they're imprisoned and they're disappeared all the time in Yemen. And so we did this very delicate, careful balance, to make sure that we only filmed in these facilities sort of out of sight of the public eye. We also did a lot of standard, war zone stuff, like using Faraday bags, to protect our electronics from digital security lapses. We didn't use regular email addresses. A lot of things like that, where we just had to go dark, and just use GPS monitoring the entire time we were there.
And when you're making a film like this, there's a kind of strange, sad beauty to a lot of the footage that you've shot. How do you think about being present as a human being, who's sort of personally witnessing suffering, and at the same time keep alert to the craft that's required of making a film, an attention to framing of shots and things like that? Is that something as a filmmaker that you have, that there's a balance there? How do you approach those two sides
Yeah.
of your job?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's of all the films that I've shot over the years, Marshall, I think this is probably the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that I didn't enjoy shooting. I usually, it's the part of the process that I love the most. I thrive being in the field and following the story and filming, and this one wasn't fun to film, but I felt like it was maybe the most important film I've ever done too. And so, I wanted from the outset, I wanted to be an intimate story. I wanted to um, to sort of illustrate with respect and dignity what was happening in these clinics, as these doctors and nurses were doing what I viewed as really heroic work, unheralded, right, to save the lives of children on a daily basis, and sometimes successful and sometimes unsuccessfully. And I felt it was important to show all of that, right? And so, because I wanted to be intimate, I really wanted to be a big portion of it a verite, where we just sat on shots and covered the scene very quietly, sort of fly on the wall, and just documented what happened, right? And so we have a lot of shots that are quite lengthy, that sort of just allow the scene to unfold. But I also wanted to try to innovate visually however we could, and so I sort of asked myself during the course of production, this is something I do a lot, is how can we express some of these lived experiences in visual ways, that then could be felt by the viewer in an unusual way. So one example is, we have two drone shots in the entire film, right? We open the film with the drone shot and we close it. And in the opening one, I mean, one of my biases is I hate gratuitous drone shots. I just feel like often they're overused, right? Just to show a beautiful landscape or something. And so I tend not to use them very much, but I felt like there was an opportunity to judiciously do that in this film. So the opening shot of the film is just a static shot over Sadaka Hospital, and we descend very slowly on a static frame as we sort of like layer in some radio context for the conflict, right? Just to orient the viewer. So it's an orientation device. But as we shot the film, I was thinking over and over again about how disorienting and disoriented many of the people we were working with felt like when a child dies, sort of the disorientation of grief and the displacement that many of the children felt, and the families felt, by having to travel such great distances through all these checkpoints. And we witnessed over and over again this sense of displacement and disorientation. And so I chose to end the film by the same shot, right? So we're ascending instead of descending, but I chose to rotate the camera very slowly. And the idea from a craftsman standpoint was to try to sort of like somehow express this sense of disorientation through visual vertigo, right? To slowly, as we leave this scene, to disorient the viewer, just like our subjects are disoriented, just like Dr. Al-Sadiq feels disoriented when she does everything in her power to save a child and still can't. So we did try to respond to some of the things we experienced and then find visual ways to express them throughout the film.
When you watch a film like this, you're often left with kind of a sense of hopelessness, uh, and I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about what people who have seen this film, who are moved by it, can do as individuals, as lobbyists that represent, that elect governments. What can people who have now had their eyes open to what's going on in Yemen do to address some of these problems?
Shireen, take it away.
Yeah, I'm actually going to start with Dr. Aida Sadiq's words. I was listening to an interview of hers with PRI's The World, and she said, "We need your voice to speak to your administration to help us to not support this war against Yemenis. Otherwise, you will see Yemen without Yemenis." And that's what this comes down to. It's a call to action. And I love that the film has made that message so strong, that this isn't one where we feel terrible and it's something that happened in the past and we're just, like, this is happening now, and it's happening because our government is contributing to it in a major, major way. And so for me, I would hope that people feel the sense of urgency. One child dying of starvation is too many, and we have millions of children like Umayma and Abir in Yemen, millions. The UN recently said that 2.3 million children under the age of 5, so 0 to 5, are going to be going hungry this year in 2021. 400,000 of them are going to starve. And so I think it's important for us to act right away to encourage. First of all, there's big UN donor summit coming up on March 1st, and we really need to push our government to restore aid to Yemen, so that more children don't starve to death, but also to push our elected officials. We have elections in this country. We are able to contribute to this democratic process. And so it's really up to us as taxpayers who fund this gigantic $740 billion arms budget to make sure that this isn't happening in our name, that those bombs made by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and General Dynamics are not being used to kill and maim Yemeni children and families, and that we aren't contributing to this hunger crisis, the worst humanitarian crisis on earth, according to the UN. And so I hope that people will feel empowered to contact their officials to really push them to end the war. Let's push Biden to truly end every aspect of US complicity in this war, and then work to restore aid and also, reparations and all of those things necessary for 30 million people in Yemen.
Skye, did you want to speak to that too, or?
Yeah. I mean, I everything that Shireen said resonates with me, Marshall. I guess for me personally, I guess I hope that the film is sort of a gut punch for us Americans, right? That it can create empathy for those experiencing human caused famine, right? That we are partially responsible for as Americans, and that it activates people to engage and to try to change the current dynamic. I mean, the last thing that I would want is for Hunger Ward to be a requiem, right? To be sort of simply a mournful document that goes down in the annals of history as this is what was happening then. I've always believed that journalism is, it's, someone once said it's the first draft of history, right? And I believe that, but I also believe that our piece of that as filmmakers can go a little deeper than that. That if journalism is the first draft of history, then I think film as part of that sort of fourth estate serves a really important place, right? Because whereas a short broadcast journalist piece sort of comes and goes, right? If a journalist comes in for a day at a clinic, that's going to hit the news waves and then it'll be gone in a little while. My hope is that Hunger Ward is something that hopefully has a timeliness to it and a power to it, so that people will engage in a different way, right? They'll see it and then they'll join Shireen's civil society movement and our movement to sort of get the film front and center with policymakers to engage and make sure that we sort of change the course of history in terms of how the U.S. government is currently dealing with the crisis. And on that front, there's hope. And I guess what I would add is that we just announced today that we are actually going to launch the film in tandem with MTV Documentary Films on March 1st. So it's going to be accessible to every American as of that date. So it's been a bit embargoed before then. So we have a big launch date now. So it's going to be much more accessible, and hopefully we're going to try to marshal resources around that to activate sort of the already robust civil society movement.
Congratulations on that. That's exciting. And if you were somebody who had just seen this film and you want to know more, is there one book or one give somebody the next step? They've taken their first step. They've seen this film. What's the next step for somebody who wants to understand this conflict better?
Call Shireen, and she'll tell you everything.
You're gonna pop her cell phone number in the chat there. I think that's a good idea.
I'll let you take that, Shireen. You can go to our website from a film standpoint, hungerward.org, and then there's lots of different ways to engage with Shireen's work and others' work. The Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, which is doing such great work as well. You can engage with your legislators through our website. You can donate directly to the 2 clinics that you see in the film. So that's what you can do from a film standpoint. But Shireen, I know you can probably lead to some even greater resources.
I mean, that's a struggle with that question. The only reason I'm doing this, I'm an educator. I didn't study politics. I had nothing to do with activism before this, but I started writing and talking about Yemen because I felt like there weren't enough resources out there or enough Yemenis talking about this in a way that was meaningful. And so I've been writing for In These Times and other outlets to try to educate the American public, and I talk to whoever will invite me basically about this topic, because there needs to be a lot of like context, and oftentimes these things are reported in isolation and then people feel like it's too confusing. But there's got to be like some, maybe I'll write something more substantially one day, but it's really difficult to try to find something out there that is comprehensive at this point, given that the conflict is still going on. But organizations like Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation are fantastic. Yemeni Alliance Committee, they're based in the Bay Area, and they do a lot of US-based activism around this issue. Groups like Just Foreign Policy or Action Corps or FCNL do a lot of this anti-war lobbying around Yemen. So I would encourage folks to follow them on Twitter or on Facebook. My Twitter is, dedicated to Yemen. And so if people want to check my Twitter as well, I try to educate as much as possible and send
people. What's your Twitter handle? Oh,
at Shireen818.
There's also a great series that the New York Times has been covering the Yemen conflict pretty consistently. And so we've posted what we feel like are some of the best research articles on our website, hungerward.org. So people can go there, and that will lead them to this whole web of pretty good journalism by the New York Times that has been sort of covering the conflict for the past 6 years.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us and for making this film and for speaking and doing the activism that you're doing, Shireen, to get people to pay attention to what's going on. So you're both doing great work, and I am grateful that you took the time to talk to us. So thank you both.
And Marshall, thanks for coming on board to lead the discussion. It's much appreciated. And Shireen, thank you.
And thank you for making such a powerful film.